It began on a calm Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the sun felt just warm enough to tempt you outside, but not so hot that it became a chore to breathe. My coffee was still steaming on the porch railing when I noticed the envelope. It wasn't a bill from the power company, and it wasn't a letter from a neighbor. No, it was stamped with the smug logo of our homeowners association. That little crest of self-importance had a way of making my stomach turn. Before I even opened the letter, inside was a neatly printed notice, a fine, $2,000, for unauthorized parking. The alleged violation? My truck, parked in my own driveway, on my own land. It was the kind of petty power grab only someone who had never been told no in their life could dream up. The president of our HOA, a man named Gordon Whitaker, was notorious for it. He thrived on intimidation. The kind of person who could turn a simple neighborhood into his personal fiefdom. He'd fined people for having garden gnomes visible from the street. He'd cited retirees for non-standard mailbox paint. He once even forced a single mother to replace her front door because it wasn't in harmony with the community aesthetic. This was the man who had decided my truck was a personal affront to his kingdom. Most people in the neighborhood either paid their fines quietly or moved away. The thought process was simple. It was easier to comply than to fight. But I wasn't most people. My family had lived in this house for over 20 years. I had personally repaved the driveway with my own hands. I wasn't about to hand over $2,000 because Gordon wanted to feel powerful over a morning cup of tea. I reviewed the HOA bylaws, or at least the copy every homeowner was given when they bought into the neighborhood. Nowhere did it mention restrictions on vehicles parked in driveways unless they were non-operational or unregistered. My truck was both operational and fully registered. That meant one thing. This fine was not about rules. It was about control. The easy choice would have been to file an appeal through the HOA's so-called dispute resolution committee. But the committee was just Gordon's friends and loyalists, people who owed him favors or feared his retaliation. Going through them would be like arguing with a mirror that only reflected Gordon's smirk. No. If I was going to fight this, I would have to go higher. I started digging. I learned how our HOA operated, how the board was elected, and how its finances were structured. I discovered that in addition to monthly dues, the HOA had a substantial reserve fund, more than $400,000, and the board controlled every cent of it, without oversight from the city or county. That kind of money explained why Gordon guarded his position like a dragon hoarding gold. But in my digging, I also found something else, something he likely didn't want anyone to know. Our HOA bylaws allowed any homeowner to run for the board during the annual meeting, and the presidency went to whoever the board elected from among themselves. The entire board could be changed in a single election, if someone was bold enough to try. That seed of an idea took root in my mind. Gordon could write as many fines as he wanted, but what if he suddenly wasn't president anymore? What if the very system he used to punish others was turned against him? It wouldn't be easy. I'd have to convince enough of my neighbors to vote for new board members, and that meant learning everything I could about Gordon's past actions. His misuse of funds, his selective enforcement of rules. It meant turning quiet resentment into vocal opposition. I'd have to become the person willing to stand where everyone else stepped back. The first step was documenting everything. I photographed my truck in the driveway with timestamps. I collected copies of every show notice I'd ever received. And I started talking to other homeowners. Slowly, stories emerged. Fines for lawn heights, for children's toys left in yards, for hanging flower baskets that were too large. Some had even received violations for having the wrong shade of curtain visible from the street. Gordon wasn't just strict. He was obsessive. The more I learned, the clearer my path became. This wasn't just about my $2,000 fine anymore. This was about dismantling the little empire Gordon had built on fear. If I could get elected to the board, and if enough like-minded people joined me, we could rewrite the rules, audit the finances, and maybe even cut dues. But elections were still months away, and Gordon's fine had a 30-day deadline. That gave me two problems to solve: avoiding immediate payment and building the momentum to win in the long run. I decided to file a formal request for records, which the bylaws allowed. I demanded to see the HOA's financial statements, meeting minutes, and enforcement logs. Gordon, by law, had to provide them, and I suspected he'd hate every second of it. While I waited for his response, I started making quiet alliances. The couple across the street had been fined for planting roses. The family down the block had been ordered to remove their basketball hoop. I told them my plan. No speeches, no rallies, just a simple idea. If we work together, we can vote him out. Every person I spoke to seemed to carry years of frustration. And now, for the first time, they had a place to direct it. The day the records arrived, I knew I'd struck gold. Buried in the meeting minutes were notes about discretionary expenditures, vague entries with no receipts attached, landscaping invoices that exceeded normal market rates, and most interestingly, multiple payments to a private security company that no one in the neighborhood had ever seen. I didn't yet have proof of outright theft, but I had enough to make people ask questions. Questions that Gordon wouldn't want to answer in front of the entire community. The fine on my driveway was still sitting there like a thorn, but I no longer cared about it in isolation. It was just the first domino. I was going to make sure the entire row fell, and when it did, it would be Gordon picking up the pieces, not me. By the time the 30-day deadline came, I sent Gordon a certified letter disputing the fine and stating my intent to challenge the current board at the next election. No shouting, no insults, just a statement of intent. What I didn't expect was his reaction. That very night, 2 new violation notices appeared on my door, one claiming my grass was too long, and another accusing me of having an unapproved structure in my backyard. The structure in question? My garden shed, which had been there for over a decade. It was clear. The battle lines were drawn. Gordon wasn't going to back down, but neither was I. I wasn't just defending my driveway anymore. I was preparing to take his seat. And that's when I realized, to beat someone like Gordon, you can't just fight the fines. You have to own the battlefield. The first step to owning it was to own the HOA itself. Chapter 2, Building the Army. The notices on my door were more than just petty harassment. They were a declaration of war. Gordon wanted me tangled up in so many violations that I wouldn't have time, energy, or resources to challenge him. What he didn't understand was that every letter he taped to my door only fueled me more. He thought intimidation would force me to comply. All it did was confirm that my plan was working. I was getting under his skin. I knew I couldn't take him down alone. If I wanted to replace the board, I needed an army. Not the kind with uniforms or weapons, but the kind that showed up on election day with ballots in hand and a shared determination to end his reign. The first phase was information. I spent nights combing through the records Gordon had been forced to give me. The financials were full of strange entries, tens of thousands spent on beautification projects that no one in the neighborhood could identify, inflated contracts for simple maintenance jobs, and unexplained security patrol, fees billed to a company that didn't even have a listed address. Then there were the enforcement logs. They painted a clear picture, selective targeting. Gordon's friends and loyalists were mysteriously immune from violations, even when their properties clearly broke HOA rules. Meanwhile, those who had questioned him in the past had been bombarded with fines and inspections until they either complied or left. It was the kind of pattern that once you saw it, you couldn't unsee. The next phase was recruitment. I started with the people I already knew. The couple with the rose bushes. The family with the basketball hoop. I shared my findings in quiet. Conversations over coffee, on front porches, and during weekend walks. One by one, they told me their own stories of Gordon's overreach. The man had created an environment where no one felt safe in their own homes unless they stayed invisible. But my biggest breakthrough came when I spoke with Elaine, a soft-spoken retiree who lived on the corner lot. She'd been fined 3 times for overgrown shrubbery, despite having neatly trimmed hedges. She had quietly paid the fines to avoid trouble. When I showed her the enforcement logs, she saw something she hadn't expected. Gordon had personally signed off on every violation against her, while ignoring actual overgrown yards elsewhere. Her voice shook as she read the page, not from fear, but from years of pent-up anger finally finding an outlet. Elaine didn't just agree to vote for a new board. She offered to help spread the word. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years and knew everyone. With her on my side, the movement began to take shape. We didn't make speeches or hang flyers. That would have tipped Gordon off. Instead, we worked quietly, speaking to people in driveways, chatting during walks, catching neighbors while they picked up mail. The goal wasn't to create a public scene. It was to build a silent majority. I also began researching HOA law more deeply. I learned about proxy voting, the ability for members who couldn't attend the annual meeting to authorize someone else to vote on their behalf. That was the key. If we could gather enough proxies from residents who couldn't or wouldn't show up, we could control the outcome without Gordon realizing how much support we had until it was too late. Weeks passed, and the list of supporters grew. Some were hesitant, worried about retaliation, but when I showed them the financial records and enforcement patterns, their hesitation turned into resolve. The more they learned, the more they wanted him gone. Meanwhile, Gordon escalated his attacks. He began driving slowly past my house at odd hours, clipboard in hand. A letter appeared accusing me of unauthorized modifications to my mailbox, despite it being standard issue. Then came a threat of legal action over property damage because my tree dropped branches on the sidewalk during a storm. It was laughable, but it also revealed something important. Gordon was scared. His grip on power had been built on the assumption that no one would challenge him. Now, for the first time, someone was not only challenging him, but building a coalition strong enough to win. As the annual meeting approached, I finalized my plan. I would run for one of the open board seats. 2 of my allies would run for the others. With 3 seats up for election and our proxy count climbing, we had a real shot at taking the majority. If we won, we could vote Gordon out as president immediately. The night before the election, I sat at my desk, going through the proxy forms we'd collected. The stack was thicker than I'd dared to hope. If every one of these counted, and they were all valid, we would have the numbers. The victory was within reach. But I also knew Gordon wouldn't go down without a fight. He had ways of bending rules, twisting procedures, and using the bylaws as weapons. He might try to disqualify proxies, claim improper notice, or even delay the meeting entirely. I had to be ready for every trick in the book. The morning of the meeting, I arrived early at the community center. The parking lot was already half full, and Gordon was there wearing his usual smug grin, shaking hands with his loyalists. He looked calm, too calm, and that told me he had something planned. As neighbors trickled in, I saw Elaine working the room quietly, handing out pens and reminding people to sign in. My other allies kept watch on the sign-in sheet, making sure every eligible voter was counted. I carried the stack of proxies in a sealed envelope, ready to hand over when the time came. When the meeting finally began, Gordon took the stage with his usual pomp, talking about preserving the community's integrity and enforcing standards for the benefit of all. But I noticed a small pile of papers next to his podium. They weren't on the agenda, and I had a sinking feeling I knew what they were. The moment he opened them and began reading, my suspicion was confirmed. He announced that several proxy forms had been invalidated due to incorrect formatting and missing information. The proxies he was referring to were ours. He was trying to kill our majority before the first vote was even cast. But he wasn't the only one who had come prepared. In my bag, I had copies of every proxy form, every signature, and a printed copy of the HOA bylaws outlining exactly what constituted a valid proxy. Gordon had no idea that this fight was about to turn into something much bigger than a neighborhood squabble. I wasn't just defending votes. I was about to put Gordon on the defensive in front of the very people he thought he controlled. Chapter 3, The Election Ambush. The room had the heavy, uncomfortable air of a place where something important was about to happen, and where not everyone was going to like the outcome. The folding chairs were arranged in stiff, straight lines, filled with neighbors wearing everything from casual jeans to pressed business suits. Some whispered quietly, glancing toward the front. Others sat stiff and silent, their eyes locked on the stage. Gordon stood at the podium, leaning into the microphone with a practiced confidence. His voice was calm, but his words were surgical. Each invalidated proxy, he announced, chipped away at our advantage, reducing our numbers on paper. He didn't just call them invalid. He made sure to read the homeowner's name aloud, as if to shame them for daring to oppose him. It was a move straight out of his intimidation playbook. But what Gordon didn't know was that every single proxy form in my possession had been checked, rechecked, and cross-verified with the HOA's own guidelines. The so-called errors he claimed to have found were nothing more than excuses. His real goal was obvious: to eliminate enough votes to preserve his control. When he finally paused, I stood up from my seat near the middle of the room. All eyes shifted toward me. In my hands, I held a folder thick with documents, the very same proxies he'd tried to erase from the count. I walked to the front of the room slowly, letting the sound of my footsteps fill the brief silence. The bylaws, printed and highlighted, sat on top. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I simply placed the documents on the table in front of the secretary and stepped back, forcing her to read them. One by one, she compared them to the invalid list. One by one, they matched the requirements perfectly. A murmur began to ripple through the crowd. People who had been silent during Gordon's opening remarks now shifted in their chairs, leaning forward. It was the sound of doubt in the man they'd been told was untouchable. Gordon's jaw tightened. His voice, still calm but noticeably sharper, insisted that the board had the final authority to decide the validity of proxies. But the secretary, clearly uncomfortable, hesitated. She flipped back to the bylaws, reading the section aloud that confirmed any proxy meeting the outlined criteria was valid and could not be dismissed without cause. The moment the words left her mouth, the tide shifted. With the proxies reinstated, our numbers were restored. Gordon knew it. I knew it. And the neighbors who had been sitting quietly on the fence now realized they were watching the rules being bent and then broken right in front of them. The trust he'd relied on for years was cracking. The voting began. Ballots were passed down the rows, names checked off the list, and the proxies I had gathered were counted alongside the in-person votes. I kept my eyes on the process, watching every paper slip into the locked box. Gordon's supporters tried to maintain their composure, but the tension was unmistakable. When the counting started, the room fell into an uneasy hush. The only sounds were the soft shuffle of paper and the quiet click of a pen. Marking tallies, my hand stayed still in my lap, but my mind was already racing ahead. Winning the election was just the beginning. If we succeeded, the next step would be dismantling Gordon's control, and that meant digging into everything he'd done during his time as president. The results came in faster than I expected. The secretary, her voice steady but betraying a hint of surprise, read the names of the new board members. My name was first, then Elaine's, then David, a father of two who'd been forced to remove his kids' playset after Gordon claimed it. Violated community aesthetics. We had swept all 3 open seats. The applause started slowly, hesitant at first as though people were testing the air. Then it grew louder, filling the small room until it bounced off the walls. For the first time in years, I saw neighbors smiling openly at one another instead of avoiding eye contact. But Gordon wasn't clapping. He stood frozen behind the podium, his fingers gripping the edges so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His carefully constructed empire had just been breached, and worse, it had happened in full view of the very people he'd ruled over. The next step was immediate. According to the bylaws, the newly elected board members would meet immediately after the election to select officers, including the president. This was the moment I had been working toward from the day. That fine landed on my doorstep. We stepped into a small side room, closing the door behind us. The hum of voices from the main hall faded into the background. The vote for president was swift and decisive. With 2 of my allies already on board, the majority was secure. When my name was announced, I didn't feel victory in the form of cheers or pats on the back. I felt it in the weight of the gavel now resting in my hand. It wasn't about the title. It was about what it represented. Control over the very system Gordon had used to punish his neighbors. And I intended to use that control to tear down the weapon he had built. We returned to the main hall. Gordon sat stiffly in his chair, refusing to look at me. I took the podium and began outlining our first actions as a new board. An immediate freeze on fines issued in the past 30 days pending review. A full audit of the HOA's finances to be conducted by an independent firm. And perhaps most importantly, an open forum at the next meeting where any homeowner could bring concerns directly to the board without fear of retaliation. The applause that followed wasn't polite or hesitant this time. It was genuine. It was the sound of a community waking up from a long, uneasy sleep. But I knew the fight wasn't over. Gordon still had influence. And influence can be dangerous when someone refuses to accept defeat. He wouldn't simply fade into the background. He would look for cracks to exploit, allies to recruit, and ways to reclaim what he'd lost. That night, as I locked my front door, I caught sight of him parked at the end of the street, his headlights off, watching, waiting. The election was won. The presidency was mine. But the war for the soul of the neighborhood had only just begun. And Gordon wasn't done playing games. Chapter 4. The Sabotage Campaign. The first week after the election felt like breathing. Fresh air after years of stale confinement. Neighbors waved as I passed, stopping to chat in ways they hadn't before. The glares that used to follow me, reminders of Gordon's influence, were gone, replaced by cautious smiles. But underneath the calm surface, I knew something else was brewing. Gordon might have lost his title, but people like him didn't lose quietly. It began with small inconveniences. A misplaced request for lawn service in the HOA's maintenance schedule. A delay in sending out notices for the upcoming community forum. Phone calls to vendors going unanswered, because they hadn't been informed of the leadership change. At first, I chalked it up to the normal chaos of a transition. But patterns began to emerge. Vendors who had worked with the HOA for years suddenly canceled contracts without warning. A landscaper claimed Gordon had told them the new board was planning to slash payments and that it wasn't worth continuing. The security company, the same one with the suspicious invoices I'd seen in the financial records, sent a curt notice stating they were ending their service agreement immediately. Every disruption forced the new board to scramble, shifting focus from the audit and rule reforms to putting out fires. And that, I realized, was the point. Gordon's strategy wasn't to confront us head-on. It was to bleed us dry through a constant drip of small manufactured crises. Then came the anonymous complaints. At first, they trickled in, vague claims about noise, yard maintenance, and unapproved decorations. They were untraceable, sent through the HOA's general mailbox with no return address. But they all had a common theme. They targeted the most vocal supporters of the new board. It was the same selective enforcement he had used before, just from the shadows. Elaine, who had stood beside me in the election, received 3 complaints in a single week. David's property was reported for excessive trash bins, even though garbage day had been the morning before. The intimidation was calculated, designed to send a message: step out of line and you'll regret it. The turning point came when the independent auditor finally began digging into the HOA's finances. Within days, they flagged a series of urgent irregularities that needed immediate explanation. Tens of thousands in payments to vendors with no physical addresses. Landscaping costs doubled in a single year without corresponding work orders. And most damning, the security patrol payments were traced to a company that, on paper, didn't exist at all. The paper trail led back to a P.O. box in the next town over. The box was registered under a generic holding company, but the signature on the rental form was unmistakable. Gordon's. It was the proof I needed. For years he had been funneling HOA funds into a shell company, paying himself under the guise of security services. It explained the inflated invoices, the unexplained expenses, the aggressive enforcement. All of it was a smokescreen for his own enrichment. But exposing him wouldn't be simple. Without airtight evidence, it would be easy for him to spin the narrative, claim the payments were legitimate, and accuse the new board of staging a smear campaign. And if I moved too soon, he could use the confusion to rally whatever loyalists he had left. So I waited and watched as his tactics grew more desperate. One night, returning home from a late board meeting, I found my mailbox door hanging open, the contents scattered across the street. Most of it was junk mail, but the HOA's bank statements were missing. I reported it, but there were no cameras nearby and no witnesses. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. A few days later, a neighbor pulled me aside. She'd overheard Gordon talking to a small group in his garage, telling them the new board was planning to triple HOA dues and sell off community assets. It was pure fiction, but in a neighborhood where gossip moved faster than facts, it didn't have to be true to cause trouble. The next board meeting confirmed my fears. The attendance was higher than usual, but the questions from the floor were sharp, accusatory. People wanted to know why contracts were being canceled, why services had been disrupted, and why dues hadn't yet been lowered. They didn't know those disruptions were Gordon's doing. All they saw was the chaos, and chaos erodes trust. I left that meeting with the uneasy realization that winning the election hadn't been the end of the fight. It had been the opening move in a longer, more dangerous game. Gordon didn't need a title to control the narrative. He just needed enough doubt, enough confusion, to turn the tide back in his favor. The audit was my trump card. Once it was complete, I could present every dollar, every fake invoice, every fraudulent payment. But until then, I had to weather the storm. Keep the board united and prevent him from regaining a foothold. And then, just when I thought I had a handle on his sabotage, something happened that made it clear Gordon was willing to escalate beyond harassment and misinformation. It was early morning when I got the call from David. His car had been vandalized in his driveway, deep scratches down both sides, a smashed taillight, and a note under the wiper blade with 3 words, "You're next, President." The war had officially left the meeting hall and moved into the streets. This wasn't just about control anymore. It was about survival. Chapter 5. The vote that shook the neighborhood. The night of the HOA election was tense, and the entire community seemed to know something was about to happen. The meeting was set in the clubhouse, a modest building with beige walls and a faint smell of stale coffee. But the air inside was heavy with suspicion. People whispered in corners, casting glances toward me as I entered. The current board members sat behind a folding table, their expressions a mix of arrogance and unease, especially Marlene, the HOA president who started all of this. She sat at the center, her fingers drumming impatiently against a stack of papers, her smile more of a grimace. Over the past few weeks, I had quietly gathered proxy votes, meeting with homeowners individually, explaining the truth about the mismanagement, the inflated fines, and the misuse of funds. I hadn't needed to smear anyone. The facts spoke for themselves. Many residents, tired of the overreach and constant harassment, had been more than eager to sign over their voting power to me. By the time the meeting began, I held enough signed proxies to control more than half the votes in the room. The formalities started predictably. Approval of the previous meeting's minutes, financial updates that conveniently left out questionable expenditures, and the usual self-congratulatory comments from the board. But when the time came for the election of board members, the tension sharpened. Marlene's voice was just a touch too loud, trying to project confidence she didn't have. She announced that all current members were seeking re-election, as if it were a formality that would pass without question. That's when I stood, calm, deliberate, and without raising my voice. I nominated myself for president and introduced my full slate of candidates for every position. A few gasps rippled through the room, followed by murmurs. Marlene's forced smile twitched, and she asked if I even qualified to run. I did. I had triple-checked the bylaws myself. The vote began. Ballots were handed out, and as each proxy in my possession was counted, Marlene's posture sank a little further. The pile in front of me grew taller than hers within minutes. Some in the room looked stunned, others quietly satisfied. The count was a formality by then. I had secured an overwhelming majority. When the results were read, the room shifted. It was as if the control that Marlene had gripped for years had been ripped from her fingers in a single moment. My slate swept every position. She sat frozen, eyes wide, the reality settling in. A few residents clapped. Others just smiled and leaned back, clearly relieved that change had finally arrived. The old board members stood, some in silence, some muttering under their breath, and left the table. I took the seat at the center, her seat, feeling the weight of the moment but also the calm satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. But the real work was only beginning. Now that I was in control, I would uncover the full scope of what Marlene had been doing behind the scenes. I suspected the fines were just the tip of the iceberg, and I wasn't about to let the truth stay buried. The next chapter of this fight wouldn't be about elections. It would be about exposing everything they'd tried to hide. Chapter 6. The Ledger of Lies. The morning after the election, I didn't waste time celebrating. The victory was sweet, yes, but the war wasn't over. I arrived at the HOA office at 7:30 a.m., coffee in hand, armed with the new board's unanimous decision, a full financial audit starting immediately. The HOA's so-called office was really a converted storage room in the clubhouse, smelling faintly of mold and burnt printer ink. The file cabinets were locked, but I now had the authority and the keys. The first thing I noticed was how meticulously disorganized everything was. Receipts were shoved into folders, labeled with vague titles like MISC expenses or community improvements. At first glance, it looked like sloppy bookkeeping. But as I dug deeper, it became clear this wasn't laziness. This was camouflage, buried in a stack of invoices. I found a $14,000 payment to a landscaping company for a lakefront dock repair. We didn't have a lake. We didn't have a dock. There was also a $9,200 security upgrade, listed under community safety, which, according to the receipts, consisted of a single motion sensor light installed at Marlene's private home. I called in Lisa, our new treasurer, a no-nonsense former accountant who'd been itching for this moment. She took one look at the records and muttered, "She's been cooking these books for years." Within 2 hours, Lisa had created a spreadsheet mapping every suspicious expense over the last 5 years. The total misuse? Just over $312,000. But the money trail didn't stop there. We found personal Amazon purchases billed to the HOA. Everything from luxury handbags to a $1,200 espresso machine. HOA funds had paid for Marlene's family vacations, her son's private school tuition, even a $7,000 emergency plumbing repair. That turned out to be the installation of a jacuzzi in her backyard. The deeper we went, the more we uncovered a network of friends and family contractors who had been billing the HOA for phantom work. One company that had received nearly $50,000 in repairs was registered under the name of Marlene's brother-in-law. No work logs, no permits, no pictures. By noon, I knew this wasn't just going to be an HOA cleanup. This was going to be a criminal case. I called in a favor from a friend in the county auditor's office. By that evening, I had a team reviewing the evidence and confirming what I suspected. Marlene wasn't just a bad board president. She was a thief. When I called an emergency HOA meeting to present the preliminary findings, the room was packed. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now leaned forward, hungry for the truth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply laid out the facts, line by damning line, and projected the receipts on the screen for everyone to see. Gasps and murmurs spread like wildfire. Marlene, seated at the back, didn't speak once. She just stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, her hands gripping the arms of her chair like she was holding on for dear life. When I finished, I announced the next step, a formal report to the county prosecutor's office. That was when she finally stood, muttering something about political witch hunts before storming out of the building. I watched her leave without a word. I didn't have to chase her. The law would do that for me. Chapter 7. The Aftermath and the New Order. The neighborhood felt different now, not louder or quieter, but sharper, cleaner, more aware. Word of my hostile takeover of the HOA had spread faster than wildfire. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact with me now nodded from their porches. Some gave subtle salutes of approval, like we'd won a war no one thought could be won. Others kept their heads down, still unsure if siding with me was the safest move. I had stepped into the role of HOA, president not for the prestige, but for the principle. It was about making sure no one else in this community was ever bullied, fined, or harassed for existing on their own property. The first board meeting under my leadership was quiet, almost eerily so. The old guard, the ones who had loyally served under Patricia's petty reign, had either resigned in protest or kept their distance. Those who remained shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, no longer barking orders or waving bylaws like weapons. The first changes were swift. Every predatory fine Patricia had issued in the past 2 years was reviewed and refunded, if it was baseless, which turned out to be the majority. Landscaping violations for having native plants, noise complaints for kids playing basketball in their driveways, parking citations for guests staying overnight, all wiped clean. The HOA's rulebook shrank from a thick binder of arbitrary demands to a slim, reasonable document. What was once a weapon became a guideline. But change doesn't come without resistance. Patricia herself had gone silent since the day I took over. Her house, which had once been the hub of all HOA scheming, was dark most evenings. Some whispered that she was plotting her return. Others claimed she was too humiliated to show her face. I didn't care. If she wanted to play chess, I'd already taken her queen. Still, I knew better than to believe the battle was truly over. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Patricia's looping, theatrical cursive. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a formal complaint accusing me of misappropriation of HOA funds and unlawful seizure of governing authority. The irony was delicious. I didn't even need to respond. The new bylaws, and the ones I had just implemented, required all such accusations to be reviewed by an independent neighborhood vote. When the meeting was held, Patricia's claims crumbled. The community didn't just reject her complaint. They voted to ban her from holding any HOA office for the next decade. It was poetic justice, signed, sealed, and delivered. With her last attempt at power smothered, I turned my attention to something bigger. The HOA was no longer just an association. It was a shield for the residents. I introduced neighborhood improvement projects that had been dismissed for years under Patricia's regime, community gardens, upgraded playground equipment, and better security lighting for the darker streets. People started talking about our neighborhood in a new way, not as the place with that nightmare HOA, but as the community that had overthrown one. Even nearby developments took notice. A few reached out, asking for advice on how to reform their own tyrannical boards. Without realizing it, I'd become the face of a small but growing movement. And yet in quiet moments, I could feel the lingering eyes of those who still didn't approve. Old grudges don't dissolve overnight, and some wounds in this neighborhood ran deep. But as I looked out from my own driveway, the same driveway that had once cost me $2,000 in bogus fines, I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. This wasn't just my property anymore. This was my territory, and I had no intention of letting it fall back into the wrong hands. The war with Patricia was over. Chapter 8, The Final Strike. Ownership had brought power, but power came with the weight of expectation. Every homeowner in the neighborhood now looked to me as the one who had finally broken the HOA's stranglehold. I didn't just want to keep the old board's corruption from returning. I wanted to dismantle every rotten root they had left behind. The first step was a forensic audit. The neighborhood accountant, someone the old board had refused to hire, combed through years of records. The results were worse than I had imagined. Money wasn't just wasted. It had been funneled into personal accounts. HOA funds paid for vacations, luxury furniture, and even landscape projects that never happened. The former president's name appeared again and again. She had siphoned thousands under the guise of maintenance fees and emergency projects. Her arrogance had left a paper trail so wide it was impossible to ignore. I contacted the attorney who had helped me win my takeover. We prepared a lawsuit that would not just seek restitution, but also place a permanent ban on her ever holding a position in any HOA again. The process would be long, but it was worth it. This wasn't just revenge anymore. It was justice. Meanwhile, I called a full neighborhood meeting. No hidden agendas, no secret votes, just transparency. For the first time in years, the room wasn't tense. People actually smiled. They weren't afraid of fines for lawn color or car placement. They weren't worried about random violations appearing in their mailbox. I stood at the front and outlined a new set of rules. No fines without a direct and provable violation of local law. All decisions would require a community vote. No board member could serve more than 2 terms. Every financial record would be open to the public. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was pure relief. Years of intimidation had been replaced by the sound of neighbors, finally breathing free. But there was one last matter. The old HOA office still stood at the edge of the neighborhood, a physical reminder of their rule. I had the locks changed, moved the files into digital storage, and sold the building. The proceeds went directly into a community improvement fund. On my last walk through the empty office, I noticed the former president's old chair. I didn't sit in it. I didn't want to. That seat had been a throne for tyranny. I left it behind, just as we'd left the old ways behind. By the time the first year ended, the lawsuit was underway. The neighborhood was thriving, and the HOA, once a weapon of control, had become exactly what it was supposed to be, a servant to the community. And as I locked my front gate that evening, parking my car squarely in my driveway without a second thought, I couldn't help but smile. The fight had started over something as small as a parking fine. But it ended with a neighborhood finally free. But the war against every HOA tyrant out there, had only just begun. Thanks for watching! Hey everyone! Thanks for watching another epic HOA revenge story here on HOA Stories. This chapter wraps up one of the most satisfying takedowns we've seen yet. From years of corruption and abuse to a full community victory, it just goes to show that sometimes the smallest battles, like a parking fine or a lawn complaint, can spark the biggest changes when you refuse to back down. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of HOA drama, petty neighbor wars, and justice served cold. We post new, high-quality stories regularly, each packed with twists, strategy, and satisfying payback. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were in this situation? And have you ever taken on an HOA or a power-hungry neighbor? We love reading your experiences and might even feature them in a future video. Your support keeps these stories coming, so hit that bell icon and stay tuned. Until next time, keep your lawn green, your fences strong, and your HOA on their toes. Thanks for watching and see you in the next story.